Right. Right. Okay, well, hi, I'm V-RADIO. I'm an independent, left-leaning person. I was part of Occupy Wall Street, Detroit, and Flint. So I've been doing this for quite a while. I actually started doing independent journalism back in like 2008. I took a long break for a while because I have children who wanted to be involved in sports, and my dad was not really supportive of anything I wanted to do, so I was not going to be that guy. Basically, is what it amounts to. Um, so as a consequence, I had just kind of pulled myself away from politics for a long time. And what ended up changing for me was that I had seen the direction things were going, but more importantly, I think what motivated me was just that there was a lot of, how would I put it? Well, I mean, just blatant disinformation. I mean, some of it was like when Bernie Sanders got nominated, that kind of energized me a little bit to be interested again because there was finally a candidate that I could actually kind of get behind. But at the same time, there was also things that were happening at the time. It was basically like the Kyle Rittenhouse thing was one of the biggest. Was that I was watching it go down, and there was so much stuff that people were saying all over the internet that just wasn't remotely true. Like it wasn't. It's not a question of opinion. These are things that like you could get, proof of what was happening and what wasn't, and people were still like so polarized about it, so tribal about it, and that was one of the things that motivated me to get back out there because it was frustrating to watch people like just kind of put together these little Twitter videos and stuff like that to try to get some idea of what was happening, and they weren't really getting a good picture of it. So I did a documentary about it, and my work actually managed to get Joshua Zeminski arrested. They used my video during the trial too. And it wasn't just my work alone. There were other investigators who gave me information, for example, to identify who Joshua Zeminski was. He was the first shooter. A lot of people don't even know who he is, but he's the first person who fired a firearm. Yeah, yeah, he was. He was. But the point is that that was a really critical piece of information that a lot of people didn't have, and they still don't really talk about it. But the point is that that was one of the things that launched me back into getting into it. And then I realized, beyond just the Rittenhouse thing, I was like, man, people are just lying constantly about everything. I was like, and it's not it was both sides doing it, and that's when I started also kind of I stumbled on the documentary specifically about our social media, like Creepy Line and Social Dilemma, that kind of talk about the fact that it seems like they're cashing in on this by our feeds being catered to keep us on our phones or our computers longer. And the best way to do that is to either constantly show you stuff that makes you angry or to show you stuff that reinforces your worldview. And I mentioned that actually at the beginning of the previous stream that you and I were on, because I think it's a large part of the reason why we're heading in this direction where things just keep getting more and more and more radical. So in any case, my content, while I am left leaning, I don't really do a whole lot of right versus left so far as economic policies and stuff right now, because I'm a bit more focused on can we have like intelligent conversations with people, who we disagree with, and be able to come to like, a consensus based on, being informed, and so my area, like my Discord, my chat rooms, things like that are kind of a quote unquote safe space for like constructive conversation. And as a consequence of that, I have conservatives and leftists who watch my content, can engage with it and not start, screaming at each other, cussing at each other, whatever. and actually start to kind of come to a common ground. So that's basically what my work is about. Mm-hmm. No, I understand. I understand. Right. Yeah, I do a whole series called Do You Think for Yourself that's about these psychological effects that people don't realize that everybody's susceptible to, but if you're aware of them, that can help. So things like the Milgram experiment or the Ash conformity experiment or the bystander effect, the ones that you can recreate, like as in their functional real science. That if I do this experiment again, I'm going to get the same. So anyway, yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt. I was just like I have kind of a passion for that too. People need to be re-equipped with how to, like I would say, self-defense for your mind. Like at the end of the day, I tell my audience all the time, you're not going to agree with everything I say, and I don't actually want you to. Like, I'm not a Vosh or a Stefan Molyneux who just wants a army of like people who just agree with everything they say. That's not me. So yep, I actually debated Stefan Molyneux many years ago. Okay, so unfortunately, hold on just a second. Are they saying that you can? Yeah, I'm trying to make sure that they can hear you, and for some reason it's like freaking out. Hold on. Oh, I know what the problem is. Hold on just a second. This is fixable. For some reason it had you way down. So I apologize, everybody. We are now experiencing technical difficulties. Please stand by. So do me a favor, and in a moment I'm going to ask you to talk again. Go ahead. Fuck. Oh, man, it's still not, no, it doesn't look like it's working. 1 second. This is the, mm-hmm. Okay. Well, yeah, I was hoping that they could listen to us live and comment so that I could engage with them and have them engage with you. Yeah, right. Why is it doing that? That's weird. All right, 1 second. I have an idea. Haha. Clicking. Maybe it's in Discord. No, it wouldn't be in Discord. Advanced audio properties should be enabled. Yeah, I'm trying. It's not coming through at all. Like you would think it was muted or something, but that's weird because it was literally working like last night. Nope, not. Okay. Yep, I'm actually doing that right now. Yep. Yep. What would it be set to? Desktop audio. Okay, here we go. Yep. Headphones, speakers. No, I don't want to do that. What the heck? This like worked just fine. I mean, the only thing that happened last time was like it didn't want to let like the video was choppy. That was what happened last time, which is actually why I directed people to go to your stream to listen to that full debate, because yours looked right and mine did not. You know, it was hard to tell sometimes what people were saying, but I'm gonna go into settings one more time and see if I can fix this, and if not, I'll just tell them just to run over to your stream. Audio, desktop audio. There's default, and then my speakers and my headphones. Let's try this. All right, and then desktop audio too. I don't see a. It's this one. Okay, testing, testing. Say something.
Can you all hear me on V-RADIO stream now?
They should theoretically hear you now. All right, now let me go back to it. My apologies, everybody. This is like the second time I've ever used Restream, so... All right, yep, now they can hear you loud and clear. Let's rock and roll. Sorry about that, guys.
All right, cool. All right, technical difficulties happen. No, it's all good. I've had them. I was
normally a StreamYard guy, so like the StreamYard, I know what to do exactly, but StreamYard, I didn't like to use OBS for. But anyway, let's continue on with the intelligent part.
Sure. So I actually don't remember where I was going. We were saying something about stuff in Molyneux and how it was kind of like involved in thermal circles, and then we can start talking about the actual topic. So political violence. You were saying there are things that trigger people, yada yada yada.
So let's get okay, I was talking about like there are psychological effects that everybody is susceptible to, whether they realize it or not, that are like long-standing established psychology.
Right.
And one of the major ones that I talk about a lot is the Ash conformity experiment, which isn't necessarily about political violence necessarily, but it can be, but basically it's an experiment that you can reproduce. People have done it. The experiment is actually only being done on one person, but they don't know that. And they put lines on a wall. And for the first 3 times, everybody's giving the correct answer to like, okay, which one of these lines is the same length as this line? Basically, the correct answer. And then after about 3 answers in, they start giving the wrong answer, and they're trying to gauge on whether or not the person, because they don't know that everybody else in the room is an actor. Basically, everyone else in the room is helping with the experiment. And so 2 things that they found, the first of which was it was about 30 to 40% of the time, the person will just go along with it and start doing what everybody else did. The other thing they found was that if there's at least one other person in the room who's giving the right answer, that they're considerably less likely to go along with the wrong answer. But the other thing that they pointed out is that the more people that this experiment is done with, like, if you get a room of 10 people, it's one thing. 3 people, it's like, what, are you crazy? Like, of course those lines are, but you get like 30 people in the room, well, now you got a problem. That's when, between that and the Milgram experiment was actually done by somebody who was trying to understand how Nazis could be conditioned to participate in the atrocities that they were in. And what they found, and this is another replicatable study, was that if somebody is in a position of authority, in many cases, people will go along with it. And that's kind of like the Nuremberg trials. Well, I was just following orders, and so those are things that are real psychological phenomenon. I would say combine that with the fact that humans as a species are so arrogant as to believe that we are completely devoid of any of the animal instincts, like the herding instincts and the pack instincts and stuff like that. And we still are susceptible to all of those things. What I would say makes us different as humans is that we can still study and come to a better understanding, and hopefully be able to mitigate how much those things direct our lives. That's why we don't go around doing every negative impulse like, say, a caveman might do, right? So those are all things that I think are important. I mean, in addition to the fact that we used to be a society that kind of encouraged people to learn about things like logical fallacies. The reason why somebody's attacking you during a debate is because they realize their position is kind of weak, so they're trying to distract away from that by just trying to attack your social credibility. Like, if we're discussing a debate about, I don't know, the weather, and, you bring up that I had an affair with my wife, that's an effect to try to discredit me to the audience, so that they don't, at that point, they're less likely to trust the things I say, even though it has nothing to do with what we're debating about. And I'm confident you probably already know about all of this, but I'm placing it just for the sake of the audience. That those are the kinds of things that I think that people are not aware of, in addition to like appeal to mockery and other stuff we just commonly see in our politics, that in my opinion is making it extremely hard for people to have a clear view on things, on anything that we're going to discuss. So as far as political violence, during the Occupy movement, we were strictly nonviolent, and the Occupy movement enjoyed widespread support, largely bipartisan, despite the fact that we were known to be kind of a leftist movement. Everybody pretty much agreed that the bank bailout was crap, right? And we were very careful about how we went about it. And as a consequence, we had support where a lot of the more violent movements now do not. And we've seen a serious downturn in the support, for example, for Black Lives Matter, and the funny thing is a lot of these people still believe in the validity of the concerns that are being raised. It's a question of, and there's science to back this up. I actually pulled up all the articles I used on my little documentary about this, that doing things like this make you seem less reasonable. So if you seem less reasonable, then people are less trusting of your point of view. It's like, okay, I agree with you that violence against X group is bad, but why are you targeting innocent people's buildings and businesses? Because that makes everything else you look at that point, everything else you're doing look suspect. I mean, that's outside of the issue of morality. You just don't look trustworthy anymore. So anyway, that was my initial take. I've kind of proselytized enough, so have at it.
Well, no, I don't think we actually disagree much. Pardon me, I had a late lunch. But I think the issue is that, well, maybe it's not an issue. Do you believe there is a point at which violence is necessary at all?
Well, people ask me that, largely because my moniker is like the character from V for Vendetta. What I would say is that if you've come to a point where we really are in a circumstance where we have to do violence, well, now we've stepped out of activism. And now we're at war. I don't feel that those are the same things, nor do I feel that, the second one is definitely not what you want. I think a lot of people, that was the funny thing is we joked about Tim Pool or whatever, when people talk about could there be a civil war, if such a thing was to occur, it's not going to look anything like the civil war that people have in their heads. There's not going to be states seceding. There won't be lines of battle. The only kind of war that would come out of this would look more like the frickin' Purge or gang warfare during the Prohibition. It's not going to be pretty, and a whole lot of innocent people would get killed. I also don't think we're going to get to that point. I think that there are people who have a very romantic idea in their head, and I've interacted with a lot of radicals who, so for example, the Weather Underground back in the 60s, some of their members literally went to Cuba to be trained to become quote unquote armed revolutionaries / terrorists. And they were under the understanding that they were going to try to overthrow the government, and allow China and other major communist countries to come and take over the United States. So that was their stated goal. And while eventually what happened is the most militant among them blew themselves up, like the ones who were really on par with, yep, we need to go start killing people towards this end. And that was probably one of those moments as if it was a sci-fi movie where everything shifts, because it scared the hell out of the rest of the Weather Underground. Like, okay, well, we're not going to do that anymore. That was crazy. But they still had a very strong leaning towards violent activism. And while the Weather Underground, many of them got arrested, What you will find now, for example, two of them were pardoned by Bill Clinton in his final hour as president. They hold positions, like, for example, one of them is on the board of directors of some organization that initially funded Black Lives Matter. They went into education, they went into law. So they have an influence. It's just not necessarily always as direct. And like you may have heard about the DA in San Francisco who got recalled because they were just they had a very loose on crime attitude. Well, come to find out that that guy is the child of two members of the Weather Underground. So my point is that these influences to try to make us violent had always existed on the left. And they tried to take hold even during Occupy. And so Antifa at that time, usually as people just called it the Black Bloc, but they existed exactly as they do now. And if I showed you videos of them acting at Occupy, you would have trouble realizing what what time frame we're talking about. Like if you look at these old videos, it's just like, oh, okay, well that looks like a Black Lives Matter riot, because it was exactly the same people. And then there was another organization called BAM, By Any Means Necessary, which I believe is kind of the predecessor to what you see in the violent factions within Black Lives Matter. And I acknowledge that not all of Black Lives Matter is violent, just so we're clear. But the point is that those organizations have been there kind of with their intent to make things more violent. And when we were in Occupy, we were very vigilant about that. But now, instead, and this is kind of where I come from, like, as far as like the aspect of this where the current left has some responsibility, is that what we don't do enough of is we don't call them out. We don't, distance ourselves from it. And if anything, in many cases, we do things like try to become apologists for it, or we rename it like, well, these aren't riots, they're uprisings, or, like we find some other way to like try to play word games around it. So go ahead.
Well, okay, so this is where we're going to disagree.
Sure.
Ferguson, riot or uprising?
I'd call that one a riot.
You call that? Why don't you call it an uprising?
What's
the difference? What's the distinction?
Now, I want to be clear that I didn't look as closely at Ferguson because I wasn't completely plugged back in yet. But, you're looking at... So let's go over just to help me. Is Ferguson the one where Richard Spencer got punched?
No. That
wasn't Ferguson?
Well, okay, I'm going to say no, I don't think it was. Ferguson happened after Michael Brown was killed.
Okay. So...
Oathkeeper showed up with Alex Jones as well. Just another wrinkle in there.
Okay, well, so I guess the question then was, okay, if we're going to say uprising, I don't think anything that has happened in the last, like, quarter of a century would qualify. I mean, the question is, let's define uprising. That would probably help. What do we think uprisings mean?
So an uprising is a probably, I guess the best way to say it would be a legitimate culmination of grievances that turn violent in order to, it's not even steered necessarily, but it's the culmination of legitimate grievances that turn violent due to the actions of mostly the state.
Okay.
That would be the easiest definition I could come up with.
So, I'm sorry, I had to make an adjustment. Can you repeat that one more time? I promise.
The culmination of legitimate grievances that turn violent due to the actions of the state.
Okay, so then what is our objective then at that point that's different than a riot?
A riot tends to be just more chaotic, and I don't know. It's very thin one, but that's
okay.
Why
so we're establishing that it's thin. I think that I would kind of put it in the direction of framing, and that's why I felt that they were kind of playing word games when they call it uprisings.
No, I wouldn't say it's a word game, because there is a distinction, even though it might be thin. So the reason why I would say specifically that Ferguson was an uprising is because of how the police reacted to the protest that turned them violent. So the protests in Ferguson were peaceful. Despite the fact that they were peaceful, the police came in with water cannons, tear gas, anti-riot tactics, and started, as soon as they showed up, blasting people with beanbag bullets, tear gas, water cannons, dispersing crowds, not running them over, but using their vehicles to get people to disperse the crowd. Essentially, that in reaction to that, the crowd became violent. It created the violence. The escalation by the police is what caused those to turn violent.
Well,
Whereas a
Ferguson
riot is just.
Go ahead and finish.
Well, I was just going to mean like it just kind of happens. It doesn't. There's not necessarily a state action or an action by another group of people that create it in response to it. Like a riot kind of happens, whereas an uprising is like a direct response.
Well, because again, I didn't know as much about Ferguson. Let me shift it in a direction that I think where we both would be familiar, which would be, say, Kenosha. Do you consider Kenosha to be an uprising or to be a riot?
Kenosha was a riot, and also people exploiting it for criminal gang activity.
So so in other words, there's a riot present, and then there are other people being criminals. Is what you're getting at?
Yeah. And then I would also say that that's also there. The element there is that, at least to me, and based on what people had said, some of the more right-leaning people that were there to like protect businesses, the police slow walked the whole night. Whether that was directed by the mayor or the police chief, that's what happened. And so that there could have been a different approach being taken there that wouldn't have been like it. It's not pertinent. I just wanted to. It just needed to be said. So
no. It is pertinent, and I think it's relevant to discussing political violence in general because Kenosha is one I'm extremely familiar with. Obviously, having made a documentary about it. So outside of anything so far as like a political motive on the part of the police, there is a strategy that is considered to be legitimate in how to handle riots. And it basically amounts to just let it burn itself out. Like, just let them do their thing, and then when they're finished, they're finished. And I commonly, when it comes to Kenosha, run into two different groups of people. Like, so the ones who don't feel that the armed group should have even shown up don't usually have a solution for, okay, well, what do we do instead if there's a crowd just systematically destroying our city? What they usually say is, well, the cops should have done something. And again, not knowing, as much about Ferguson because I didn't look as closely at it, when you want to get rid of a riot and you want cops to do it, it sounds a lot like what you're describing in Ferguson. So it's kind of a no-win situation.
But the difference is that it wasn't a riot until the cops did it. It wasn't an uprising until the cops did it. It wasn't violent.
Okay. Well, I'm referring to the tactics. I'm not talking about the background of it. I'm saying Sure. It would have been framed that way regardless. And I think, there's a lot of different theories about why the police became hands-off so much. And some people feel that the riots were being politicized. I would tend to agree with that because we got all these pictures saying Trump's America. Like they were trying to make some kind of impression that Trump did all of that. And again, I'm not a Trump supporter, obviously. But nowadays it's Biden's America. They just keep switching it back and forth because blaming the president of the United States for absolutely everything going on seems to be what everybody does, and usually the people who do that don't even know who their congressman is. So the main point though is when it comes to whether or not, for me anyway, is so if let me go ahead and steel man here because again I don't know let me just assume you're correct about Ferguson, and I want to be clear that's not outside of the realm of possibility at all. Like when we were on the panel before, people were talking about the violence that happened during Occupy. I know, I was there, but it didn't happen it was not like that in Detroit, and it definitely wasn't like that in Flint. But it had to do with a different relationship, I feel, between those movements. But when they finally come in and get rid of you, which I might add, people tend to forget that happened during the Obama administration. That's what it looks like. They physically go in there and, if you don't comply, they make you comply one way or the other.
And I'm not going to say that's necessarily bad. It's a timing thing, or when it's whether or not that's legitimate in the time that it's being done.
Sure.
And whether other means were exhausted before doing that.
And
Seattle,
in some cases,
is a good example.
Well, that was the funny thing is I remember, I want to say it was Seattle. okay, so back during Occupy, we would have all of these different live streams we would watch because somebody was always making sure to broadcast from basically every camp. And there was this great video of this huge crowd chanting the words peaceful protest, refusing to leave an area. And the cops were responding, but their attitude towards the crowd at that point was considerably different because they weren't being fought. And then somebody in the crowd threw a bottle at the police, and the crowd literally grabbed the guy by the scruff of his jacket and threw him to the police, and then they arrested him.
Yeah, similar thing happened in 2020 at a Black Lives Matter protest. There was a guy dressed in black bloc, whether he was or not is questionable. But they literally, like, some of the protesters literally grabbed him up and like shoved him into the police, like physically shoved him into the police officer, like, you take him, and then like.
Well, right, and that's another thing that we were aware of is that one of the reasons you don't want to, it's like the COINTELPRO thing is real. That's not like tinfoil hat, and they would do it to both sides. That was one of the things that frustrates me when people talk about, say, January 6th, is that we leave out the possibility, like, for example, I'm a Michigander, when the plot to get Whitmer happened, like, come to find out later that like half the people involved were agents. So it's like, especially if you're
that's how sting operations work.
Well, right. So, but if you're the argument that would be made is that if you're kind of assisting and facilitating and creating the crime, then that's where you start to move into the realms of entrapment. I mean, I would say even leftist Crystal Ball on Breaking Points openly said that what happened to the right wingers in Michigan was wrong, and that the fact that there are obvious instigators present at January 6th is not in any way irrelevant. It doesn't mean that January 6th is okay. This is another thing that I tend to kind of point out, because I have a video, for example, of the guy they call Umbrella Man on my channel. The guy with the, dressed almost looking like a cop. He goes up to the AutoZone.
Totally a cop.
Right, yeah. A cop or someone, even if it was just some kind of weird white supremacist dude, right?
I think it was determined that he was, but yeah, go on.
And that's entirely possible. The thing that has to be different is when people say, well, there was a guy with an umbrella, I'm like, yeah, I know. I have the video. I have both versions of the video, including the one where this black guy's following him around, calling him out. I was like, but one guy getting out and breaking a window at an AutoZone and spray painting the place does not Jedi mind trick an entire crowd into looting the Target down the street. That was the part where we don't, just as Ray Epps, for example, openly telling everybody, we need to go into the Capitol. We need to go in, does not get everybody who did that, off the hook either. That's why if you are committed to nonviolent activism, it is so much harder to get in trouble for stuff like this. Because then when somebody says something like that, you turn and look at them like, yeah, you're a Fed. Get the fuck out of here. And that's what they tried to do to Ray Epps. So a lot of people figured it out right away who that guy was or what he was up to. The point is that that's one of the reasons why I was dedicated to it and why I had to in fact, I probably still have the videos of me talking at the Occupy Lansing whole Michigan summit, specifically trying to get them to pass a resolution to make it abundantly clear that Occupy in Michigan does not ever condone this. Now, at the Lansing one, everybody loved it and went along with it. But at Detroit, both BAM and members of the Black Bloc tried to stop me from getting that resolution passed. And that's because they were hoping that they could radicalize us into doing those things as well. Because some of them, I think, are actually just obvious agent provocateurs. But in some cases, they've literally brainwashed themselves into believing that they can overthrow the government. Just as the January 6th rioters had some pretty unrealistic expectations about what they could accomplish. That's why I said I just oppose all violence, period. And if you remember Chris WYSIWYG, who was even present at January 6th, openly said we don't do violence. It's never okay. When you say when it's time to do violence, well, then we're in a revolution, like an actual war. And that's a whole other animal. And I hope we never get there.
No, very much true. Sorry, I had to deal with a person in chat saying that FBI is FBI follows DNC's propaganda bullshit. Anyways, so slightly didn't hear everything you said because of that, but I don't
it's fine.
tolerate that kind of talk on my channel. Please don't do it. We can disagree about things and whether or not the FBI does things wrong, but you'll not propagandize on my chat. Sorry.
Which chat was that? I was hoping to, it's not your YouTube,
It was on Twitch.
Okay, yeah, not on your Twitch.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So, no, you're right. My concern is, and one of the things to that I think has credence with what happened with the umbrella guy is that, okay, it is a conspiracy kind of theory thing. It's one that I don't 100% believe, but I see some evidence for, if that makes sense.
Sure.
And what it is that what he was doing was then being used by police to justify escalation. And that's one of the things that they say is what they, as in people that were there, and they're politically motivated. That's why I don't fully buy into it. But that action happened. Similar actions happened other places in the city, and those actions it followed where the police were being told to go to.
Well, right, and and we saw that at because this one I am familiar with was back in because I was an activist back in 2008 initially. I want to say it was one of those world summits, and I feel stupid for forgetting the name of it, but
I know which one you're talking about.
George Bush was there. I think they call it the WTO or whatever.
Yeah,
because the crowd was there
Center,
peacefully protesting. So what they literally try to do is put a cop among them to start stuff, dressed in plain clothes. Yeah, I'm totally, believe in that, but they believe that they have to do it to go ahead and get their clearance to move riots, and I get it. And that's why
but if you're creating it, if you're the one creating it, it's not it's justification to use force, not to.
No, I'm not justifying it. I'm saying, that's a strategy. I'm agreeing with you that takes place. That's why it bothers me when, okay, so for example, if we discuss Black Lives Matter militant rioting, meaning people who are doing it on purpose, who literally call it like reparations when they loot or or whatever, and then at the same time discuss Antifa, who just openly says they're violent. Like that was the other goofy thing about this is when we were at Occupy, this was okay. So like sometime around like 2017 was when all of a sudden everyone started pretending that Antifa doesn't exist. When they were at our camp, they openly said, "Yep, this is who we are. Most of us are anarcho-communists. This is what we do. We believe you guys should join us in our revolution." Like there wasn't any of this secrecy. Then there was like this weird rebranding thing that is, I mean, I've gotten actual screenshots from some of their private forums where they just openly admit that that's an attempt to try to get people to come closer to them so that they can radicalize them.
But that's how radicalization works. Same thing with Richard Spencer's crew.
So they would say stuff like, well, the wall of moms are Antifa. Everyone's Antifa. Then they'll play that game with you like, well, don't you oppose fascism? Oh, okay, well, then you're Antifa. Well, I'm also kind of in favor of a unified Ireland, but I don't support the IRA. See how that works?
Oh, why not? IRA is big. I'm just kidding.
Right, I know. But just they try to. It's just like the Patriot Act. Well, of course you support the Patriot Act. You're a patriot, aren't you? It's nonsense. You can approve of you can of course acknowledge that Black lives do in fact matter, without being okay with Patrisse Cullors giving her baby daddy almost $1 million for quote unquote creative work, right?
Yeah.
Like you can oppose those things, and that's why people.
That's why
go ahead.
Yeah, it's why none of the Black Lives Matter local organizations actually like the national organization unless they've gotten money directly from them.
Right. Well, yeah.
The one in Austin does not, or at least did not, like the national organization for that very reason.
Well, and then but then you get like Hawk Newsom, because the New York City Black Lives Matter chapter got essentially ostracized because they were too militant. Because he would say stuff that they could not dial back. That's Mr. If they don't do what we want, there will be riots, there will be fires, there will be bloodshed. I'm like, wow, you sound like
that's terrorism.
Right, that's flat up terrorism. And that was the other thing that concerns me about this from a perspective of an activist from that time period, was that was when we were thinking, man, eventually there's all kinds of really weird stuff in the Patriot Act that they never used. There was a bunch of other stuff that they were trying to get passed, or they would just slide it into other like budget proposals or whatever. But there was an effort for a long time for real authoritarian government stuff to be passed. And that was being done by the Bush administration. So that's another reason why when I look at the left of today, they have like no memory because they're all simping for Liz Cheney just because she talks crap about Trump. And I'm like,
well, when you say the left, you're really talking about basic bitch liberals here.
Yeah, I guess we could go with that, but progressives are kind of also on board with it. It seems like anybody, if you talk bad about Trump, it's almost like baptism. All of your sins are forgiven.
No, see, that's not the way I see it. I see a lot of people saying, "Hey," and I'm in both camps. So I've been integrated with lefties, like our revolution types, and further left than that. And I'm also friends with a ton of basic liberals. Some people consider me a basic liberal. I don't, but whatever. Mm-hmm. And what I see is that, hey, at least she's calling it out and still cares about what we consider to be democracy, so that should be commended. It's not like she should be like president or she should be like in the Democratic Party making decisions.
So did you read Robert Reich saying, before you dismiss this out of hand, and then like he literally wrote an article, Liz Cheney for president, Robert Reich.
I did not read Robert Reich. I know who Robert Reich is.
Yeah,
so
he worked for Clinton,
I didn't see that
the Clinton administration,
I know who
and then
he
he
is.
became a progressive, like Bernie style pundit. And then he says, let's have Liz Cheney run for president. Well, I mean, he's very big on Medicare for all, and like, he wanted everybody to vote for Bernie over Hillary when it started.
Yeah.
The point is that there are a lot of them who do that, and I think what I'm concerned about is that I think that a lot of people don't remember just how evil the Bush administration was. And if you're worried about fascism, like, Donald Trump has his problems. Donald Trump didn't try to pass anything resembling the Patriot Act. And that was something I wondered about for a long time. I'm like, man, why isn't he just using... Because there's all kinds of stuff in the Patriot Act that he could have easily used against far left
because he's
extremists.
A showman.
Right. I tend to think...
So he did it in different ways.
Well, when I tend to think when it comes to Trump is that people tend to believe he's far more sophisticated than I think he actually is. Like you said, a showman.
Oh, he's not.
It's almost like he's playing a character. I doubt, for example, he says many of the same thing. And it doesn't mean, again, okay, so like I end up in a situation frequently because there are plenty of legitimate reasons to criticize Donald Trump. What bothers me is when I constantly have to unplug lies that are being said. It's like that isn't even necessary. Like, just talk about the things he is doing, because it makes it difficult for me to have a meaningful conversation because it makes conservatives immune to criticism about him because they're so used to hearing nonsense about him, and I think the same thing is probably true in the other direction now with Joe Biden. But, my reasons for not supporting Joe Biden go back to well before any of this. He voted for Iraq. He supported NAFTA. He's like, I knew I wouldn't vote for him way back in, I think he actually ran. Yeah, he ran in 2008. I believe he did. Yeah.
He did.
Along with Hillary. And I was like, yeah, nah, no thanks. And when you bring up the Iraq war now, people are like, well, it was forever ago, get over it. I'm like, yeah, like the people of Iraq can get over it. That's why there's this weird ideological war going on. And I know you talk about foreign policy all the time. There's this weird ideological war going on the left now. Like, are we pro-war? Are we anti-war? But that's like a segue for another conversation. But,
right.
As so far as like, what I was trying to say is that to those of us who were around when the Patriot Act was passed and then started to have questions about it, a lot of us are concerned that this push to manipulate activists to become violent, and it has twofold purposes. Like it's actually the same thing, really, as what we were just mentioning earlier. You send a cop out into the crowd, and that gives you the visual justification for taking draconian measures against activists. So then you convince activists to start inflicting millions of dollars on cities. And I watched moderate Republican friends of mine, and I mean really moderate, right, who would have been aghast at the idea that we might ever round up protesters and like ship them off somewhere, who, after watching, Antifa and the more violent videos of what goes on at some of these protests, who are like, God, just get this over with. Get these people out of here. These people are dangerous. So it's like we're slowly making people more and more comfortable with the idea that, okay, this is out of control. And that's it's just like the Emperor Palpatine convinces everybody you need to make the emperor.
The Senate.
What's that?
I am the Senate.
Right. It's exactly like that. And that's why I said you're
voices.
playing you're playing exactly into what they want, which is why Chris Hedges, who's ironically like a straight up socialist, frequently argues with Bray, who's the guy who wrote the anti-fascist manual, like what you're doing isn't going to work. And whenever we do get successful revolutions, it actually comes from getting the support of the police and getting the support of the military. And Bray just doesn't care. Like, and Chris Hedges is like, okay, whatever you say, buddy. Anyway, go ahead.
No, I don't know. We're kind of far afield, but that's how these things go. I got a question though with your knowledge about the Black Lives Matter protests and stuff. Was there any credence at all to the videos going around of people trying to hand other people bricks?
I have literally spoken to people who were there and would find these mysterious piles of bricks.
I'm not talking about the piles of bricks. Those got explained. It was okay. I'm like, I don't know. That's kind of fucking weird, but okay, I can get some of that to a degree. There was literally videos of people driving around in cars that looked like middle-aged men, white dudes in like, oh, this guy thinks it's still the 80s and can be undercover this way, trying to hand people directly bricks.
I haven't seen that.
Okay.
It doesn't sound outside of the realm of possibility. Like, one of the things that we haven't been able to get to the bottom of in Kenosha, for example, is there's a whole bunch of gunshots that are not accounted for. They're heard, but you're literally looking at Kyle when they happen, so you know that he didn't fire them.
Yeah.
And there was a report on one of the streams that there was people in a truck driving around shooting at people. We never got to the bottom of that. This kind of stuff happens all the time, which kind of brings you back to my main point. That's why actually I don't really think we're off topic. I think we pretty much it's a big picture issue. Like, I don't just want people to look at it of, hey, don't throw bricks at windows. We need to understand the whole sociological, social engineering thing going on here. And that's why I said I'm worried that violent activism is being encouraged to specifically get to this point where we get the people comfortable with the idea that anybody with a leftist ideology, anybody with a MAGA ideology, those people are all evil and should just be shipped off to prisons somewhere else so that we can give you a safe and secure galactic empire. That's why we knew that was the bait. That's what they wanted us to do. That's why we didn't do it.
Right. I don't know. The issue is, I think, is while all this is true, we can't prove it to a large degree. And there's no reason to believe it's targeting right-wingers and left-wingers in the same method, in the same way. At least from my perspective.
What do you mean?
But okay, people say January 6th. There's a lot of people around the right wing that said January 6th was all Fed, right? But we know it's not.
Right.
We know it's not because, well, no, I mean, even the majority of it wasn't Fed because we have the planning from the Proud Boys, we had the planning from the Oath Keepers, we have the command and control structures that were in place along those. Some of the people that were like, we got to get into the building were Proud Boys trying to get people to go into the building. Some of them were in the charge, in lead of the charge there. And so that seems to be a fully right-wing kind of natural occurrence, for lack of a better way to phrase this right now.
Well,
whereas with like the riots, there's all sorts of questions around them. Maybe it's because they weren't open about it, but it feels like there's more questions about who was actually leading any of that stuff, especially since the activists there were like, no, don't do it.
Have you ever watched the video of the Columbus statue attack?
Yes, but please explain.
So the video that was commonly spread was a bunch of activists throwing objects at the police saying, who do you serve? Who do you protect? Right?
Yeah.
That video got widely dispersed primarily by people we know to kind of be Antifa press. And that would have given you the impression that the whole crowd was behind what it was that they were doing.
Oh, I don't believe that.
No, and they weren't. That's just it.
Yeah.
The police then released a video because they didn't know that this video existed. It was an overhead view, and you got to watch exactly what they did, which was that there was a very highly organized group of Black Bloc, probably about 40 to 50 of them, kind of like formed up almost like a shield wall with their umbrellas. And then they caught video of like plainclothes people changing into Black Bloc. Again, these people don't realize they're being videoed.
Sure.
And they very carefully took the footage to make it look like, everybody supported what they were doing, when there was actually this enormous majority of people that are standing there peacefully protesting, like, what the heck? Like, they're not going to try to stop them, but, so what I'm getting at is that, is there an organization behind it? I think what you're going to find is that, first of all, like I said, Antifa used to just kind of openly, tell us what they were up to, and I'm still on some of those forums, so you can read what they do. They're just maybe a bit more careful about it, but at the same time, sometimes they're not. Like, if you ever study Mary Todd's channel, Mary Todd has deep dives into who these people are and what they do, and they post on Twitter, "Hey, come here, do this,"
Right.
And that's how they.
I'm not saying
gather
there's
everybody.
not.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry. I wasn't clear. I'm not saying there's not any command and control structures that happen within Antifa. We know there are. What I mean is that it seemed from the outside, and I'm not as integrated into this as you are, that there was more questions about who was leading it, from like the Black Lives Matter protest turning violent versus what happened at January 6th. Like, there's less questions in my mind of what happened on January 6th because of all the evidence that's been collected versus who were the instigators for a lot of the riots.
Now,
with
when I
Black Lives Matter.
When I made a documentary about, it was actually comparing January 6th to 2020. It was called "Hindsight is Always 2020." Basically, I watched hours of raw footage of January 6th, and I kind of came to the conclusion, and I said this during the panel, yes, there are probably people there under the deluded belief that they were going to get a certain outcome. But there were also huge swaths of people who didn't even know about any of that, who were told by Trump to peacefully and patriotically let their voices be heard. So and that's why I pointed out, yes, there is absolutely video, like the tunnel fight in particular is one that's just the most brutal video of January 6th I've ever seen. And I bring that one up because there were people lying and saying the cops just let them in. I'm like, well, at some locations they did because they were vastly overwhelmed. But the other thing is the demeanor.
You take them to a choke point. Yeah.
Well, right.
It make perfect tactical sense.
Right. And the other thing is that the demeanor of the protesters who were quote unquote let in was not the same as the ones who were in that tunnel fight. So like, that's why, like, I mean, you see this, there's a spot where, I think the New Yorker got that video where you're watching the shaman and them and they're all sitting in the Senate. And the cop just politely walks up and says, "Guys, can you please just get out of here?" And they're like, "Yeah, okay, we'll get out of here." I was like, wow, that's definitely not the same energy as that fight I was just watching a moment ago,
Yeah, there was definitely people swept up in the kinetic energy that was January 6th.
Right, and that's
I don't
why
think anybody should disagree with that.
Right, and
I still think all those people should still be arrested.
Well,
everyone that breached the Capitol should still have to.
And again, I'm not saying necessarily that that's not the case. The only thing that would bother me is that they very heavily prosecuted that, yet people who are literally the same Antifa rioters who they arrest sometimes 2 to 3 times a night are let right back out on the street, attacking a federal building or not. That's where we run into a problem. And I think some of that has to do with the fact, well, which regime is in charge at the time? So if the Democrats are friendly for some reason, and not all Democrats, obviously, friendly for some reason to Antifa protesters, to Black Lives Matter.
Well, I mean, they posted bail, though, didn't they?
Posted bail for who?
Well, there were bail... what are they called?
Do people post bail? Yes, but a whole bunch of people at January 6th have not even been permitted to do anything like that. And it depends on what they did, obviously. But there is definitely a lot of questionable stuff going on in how those people are being prosecuted. And again, the reason I'm telling the left, I'm like, don't be so comfortable with this. Like, the fact that these people are being held, and many, and it's been a while since I looked at it, so my information may be outdated. But some of those people are just being held in solitary confinement, like denied a lot of basic rights that people are normally given when they're in prison. And I'm like, you think it's cool now because you don't like those people, but like, again, precedent is a bitch,
Right. No, I'm not saying, like, to be clear so that the audience knows, I'm not saying that these people, what's happening to every single person that is being held for January 6th is correct. It is the system that we have.
And I have a question actually from my chat. Radioactive Girl Scout says, ask him do you think that people from January 6th should still be in jail without any hearings and in solitary confinement? Do you agree with that?
No one should be in solitary confinement.
Okay. Like ever?
Ever.
Or just
solitary
like, okay.
confinement is torture.
Okay. No, I'm good with that. But that's the kind of stuff they're talking about. And that's why there were a lot of people who have since said, like, well, Jesus, people have been rioting and attacking federal buildings all last year. Why is it suddenly a problem now? Not that that's okay by any means.
Well, it's a different government structure that's doing it too.
What do you mean?
The federal government's always.
Just what do you mean?
The federal government's always going to come down harder, especially when you attack the Capitol, than a state government's going to.
Well, right.
Unless you're New York, in which case, if you're in New York, you get put into solitary confinement for 2 years at Rikers Island for stealing a backpack.
Right. And there's a lot to that case that doesn't usually get talked about either. Like, the guy actually had like money and stuff in the backpack. It wasn't like just an empty backpack.
But he also didn't steal it.
Right. Well, the point is that nobody should be held like that forever. And I don't disagree with that. And the funny thing is that I don't know of any conservatives who think that that's okay either. Like it's where they pay attention to. So there's I know a ton of conservatives that are of the mind that if you commit crime, you should be just in jail, period. And they might not say they should be in solitary confinement, but there's a lot that don't actually care if once somebody is arrested, whether or not, don't care how they're necessarily treated for the most part once they go to jail. And they think they should just, once you're arrested, you're already guilty. That's the difference. There's a lot of people, especially among the pundit class. The pundit class is saying, hey, all these January 6 people are being mistreated. They don't say shit about anybody being mistreated by the criminal justice system in general. In fact, anytime that somebody brings up bail reform or anything like this, you want more crime in the cities. You're being soft on crime. Well, bail reform though is in some places that it's being implemented, you got to admit that a little bit of it is crazy. Should people who have been arrested for attempted murder be right back out on the street? I did a whole episode about this. So to recap my whole episode, bail should not exist. It should either be reconnaissance or you're in prison or jail rather, and it should be based on the crime committed in your past history. Okay, but you do believe that there are things that you should be held for. Not Wisconsin, Waukesha. Waukesha. Yeah, the Waukesha guy should not have been released from jail after beating his wife or his baby mama. Right. Yeah, he was out on like $500 bail and like had an enormous, long, violent history. Yes, but that was a failure not of bail reform. That was a failure of having bail like that at all. Well, okay. Because if he was rich, he would have been able to get out too. And we have an example of that, which I also covered in that episode. No, and I'm all about talking about whether or not it's rich people. That's for sure. I mean, there was that kid. His last name was Simpkins, and he brought a gun to school and he shot 4 people, and he was out on bail that same night for $500K. Yeah. Was it $500K? Well, it was set for 500 or something like that, but his family's upper middle class or middle class, so they were able to post bond. Right, and the reason it became relevant was he happened to be an African American kid. Yeah. Right. And that's why it kind of broke the narrative, especially since they wanted like $1 million from Rittenhouse, and he was being accused, with the possibility that he may have defended himself, but that one became political, and that's why, I agree with you. The right tried to. I'm sorry. Yeah, the right tried to turn the one you were just talking about. Right wingers tried to turn to political as well. Well, right. No, and I agree that's not correct. But that's when we have to kind of if we want to move those kinds of issues forward, then we need to unilaterally agree on certain things. So, for example, there was a Black Lives Matter chapter in, I want to say, Georgia, when a white guy got shot by the cops, and they marched, on behalf of that person, because police shootings are bad, right? If they're illegitimate, right? That needs to happen. And instead what happens is that, I think people have used the term team sports mentality before. I've used this analogy what we have on our current political stream. So, for example, the reason I get called a traitor, and aside from the fact that I'm, disabled, I don't go to protests anymore because if I was ever identified, they'd probably try to beat me up. Is that I talk truth when the left does something wrong. And they would just really rather nobody did that. It kind of reminds me, and the right does the same thing. I'm not saying they don't. The point is that what comes out of that is, it reminds me of, like, let's say you're playing volleyball in gym class in like middle school, and your team, like the gym teacher gets it wrong, and they call a point for your team, even though the ball was out. But they go, shh, don't say anything, right? Like, and if you try to speak up and go, well, the ball, then they'll go after you, right? Like, hey, shut up, man. Like, they're not necessarily going to beat you up over it. The point is that that's kind of the mentality that goes on here. Like, they, I've heard, other debates, where people are saying, well, can you stop talking about bad things that left-leaning people do? And I'm like, no, it's called policing ourselves. We used to do that. Like, I have, a video that I use, for example, of Occupy Oakland, openly making it clear we do not advocate for anything that just happened because Black Bloc protesters showed up at an Occupy Oakland thing and they smashed a bunch of windows and all that. We used to do that. We don't do it anymore. So instead, we cover up for it, or we don't acknowledge it, which unfortunately just harms our credibility in general. And then we also kind of have double standards about these things, because there are people who wanted Rittenhouse locked up for life. If they could have gotten their hands on him, they would have just shot him. That's the crowd in question was very, very clear in their intentions that they wanted to do him harm.
Given their what they knew about it, though, makes sense.
Well, it depends on which version of it. So, for example, Gage Grosskreutz believed that Kyle Rittenhouse was working for the police and shooting protesters. So when he instructed people to stop him, he was trying to prevent Rittenhouse from getting to the cops. So what would happen next? Like, I don't know what his next motive what he thought should happen next was going to be, but it wasn't going to be pleasant.
It wasn't going to be pleasant, but I'm saying, like, in order to understand why people react the way that they do and why the crowd was going to do whatever it was going to do, you have to kind of get your mind into where they were at and what information they had. Most people only had, hey, that guy just shot somebody. 100% true. Stop him. He just shot somebody. He's trying to get away. If given that situation, I might have ran after Kyle Rittenhouse as well. Like, so I'm just
right. But then the question then becomes, okay, well, then how do you proceed? First of all, he's the first quote unquote accused mass shooter to run away from his attackers, like from his victims. That was a meme that went around, actually, that he wasn't.
Yeah, I wouldn't like.
And he told Grosskreutz, I'm going to the police, and was literally running straight at the police.
But the rest of the people didn't know that.
Right, I know. And none of those situations is ideal, but I don't think anybody expected someone to walk up to someone with an AR-15 and try to attack them in hand-to-hand combat.
Right.
But I would say that if I were Gage, because Gage was armed, Kyle wasn't actively shooting anyone at the moment, and was apparently, in fact, doing exactly what he said he was going to do. I'm going to the police because he's running straight at him. He had a pistol. He had his hand on it at the time. Follow him and make sure he gets to the police.
Yeah.
That's the sane thing. You don't tell a bunch of unarmed people to attack a person with an AR-15 and then expect it to go well. Like, it was just so boneheaded. So like, there are ways to handle it if that's what you think is going on. That is not on the top of my list of how I would go about it. That's for sure. And inadvertently, and I told Gage this because he comments on my videos sometimes. I'm just like, you got those people killed. Like, you did that. You told those people to go after him. Like, you can, it's like that is on you. And he said, well, what would you have done? I said, well, let me tell you what I wouldn't have done.
I wouldn't have done what you did.
Right. But anyway, so like, but okay. So when you ask, so I come back to like identifying, because again, like I brought up V for Vendetta. Yeah, that guy was violent. The character at that point is in an actual real fascist regime where we've gotten past, like, we're beyond the pale at this point. There's every opportunity we could have had to prevent this from happening is over. Now all bets are off. Okay. But then again, as I said earlier, that's when we're at war. That's a separate scenario. If we're still trying to win hearts and minds and we're trying to convince people, then it's a different game. And
Right.
what the state is always going to want us to do, if it is evil, because you have to remember how Bush comported himself at the time. He said, like, talking bad about your president should be something that gets you locked up. He's quoted as saying that, right? Which is, again, like, Jesus, if Trump ever said something like that, but Bush is like a darling now somehow. But anyway, the point is that is a sign of a real problem, especially if they're trying to pass legislation to make that legal. Right. Like, yeah, you said something bad about the president, you're in jail. So that's why I tell people, I'm like, the state wants us to be terrorists. That would be so much easier for them to deal with than what they have now, which is they've lost their ability to control the way we communicate with society thanks to the internet. They lost their ability to, because like back when the media picked candidates, I mean, like if you I don't know how old you are, but like if you were live pre-internet, whoever got on the debates, so whoever got on the debate stage, like, was chosen by the media entirely. There was no website.
Yes. Yeah, there's a whole book about it. The Party Decides, if anybody wants to read about it.
Right. And
I disagree to a degree, but I get it.
Right. Well, the point is that they lost that. So what are they going to do to stay in control now? And it seems to me that, if they can get us to be violent, then they can get public support to just start rounding people up who say things against the government the way, say, China would. Right. And I'm not falling for it. And I'm going to stand up against anybody who suggests it, until I'm done.
Yeah, this is where we're going to disagree, because I'm a statist and I don't think that's what's going on. I think it's more ignorant than nefarious. Honestly, no one knows what they're actually doing. Some people are nefarious and trying to do what you're saying, but overall the state is not.
Well, no. And and to be clear, I don't disagree with what you're saying. So for example, my brother, he was in the Air Force, and he was an engineer who worked on top secret projects, so yes, he had been to places he's not allowed to talk about, for example. And One of the things he said was his biggest reason for believing that it would be difficult for him to accept any kind of idea like that is because he had experienced so much blatant incompetence that it comes back to the Trump thing. I think you believe this person is way more sophisticated than they really are, right? Now, so for example, George Bush himself, I don't think was very sophisticated at all. Dick Cheney, that guy.
On the other hand, Dick Cheney actually was,
Yeah, that guy's a problem, right? You can just look in his eyes and you can feel it. Like, this is a dude who's not operating with the same kind of like empathy than the rest of us.
Or maybe he is, and he's just a psychopath.
Well, I don't know. Is a psychopath of the same empathy as the rest of us?
Okay, fair enough. Right. Overly empathetic is the theory right now. Right.
So the point is that I think Bush was the front man, because Cheney has the charisma of a turd. Like, he just doesn't. I don't even know how he got through vice presidential debates. He exudes like freaking Darth Vader energy. Like, how would we not know that this guy is not a good person to have in control, right? So I guess what I'm saying is that no, I don't think it's all of the state, but I do think that there are certain elements that people would identify as deep state who would certainly like it a lot better if they could find ways to control us, because they know that they're losing their control. The fact that you and I are having this conversation and that people all over the country are listening to it means that they've lost a great deal of control.
I mean, that's true, but yeah, I don't think they ever had it in the first place, and there's too much ideological differences for any kind of sustained. We're not Egypt. We don't have like that kind of level of deep state where they literally control everything, right? Like, people think that we do. Bannon thinks we do. You seem to think that we do, or at least almost have it. I don't.
I think that they're seeking it. I'm not in a state where I believe that they have it. Because if they had it, then again, we'd be talking about a different level of escation. I think we're still in the war of ideas.
I don't even think they're sinking it. I don't think they're even seeking it. I don't buy into the whole narrative, the whole, like, for lack of a better term, New World Order kind of narrative that they're seeking absolute positive control. There are just some people that want to exploit the system, and that's the majority of people that get into politics. And then there are some people that are ideologically driven to shape politics in the way that their ideology states. And those people will use the power of the state to do so. But it's not the state trying to control people. It's just people trying to have power or, again, use that power that exists for ideological gains.
Well,
There's
then
not this comprehensive thing.
Well, then let's take it in a different angle. Do you think that the super, super wealthy seek power?
The super wealthy already have power.
Right. And who owns the government?
Shoot, that's a hard one to answer. Super wealthy people have similar interests, and those interests end up converging. There are ideological differences, and those ideological differences play out among the two major parties, or five, if you want to get really into the weeds on it. And no one controls the state in the way that you seem to be suggesting. Not
totally. The state is
like,
somewhat of a filter. But we
I would
definitely
say
have
really.
an entirely way more plutocratic system going on than was ever intended.
We do. Sure. I'm not going to disagree with that, but that's not to the level of concern that you seem to have.
I think you may believe that I'm a bit more radical on this than I actually am.
Yeah.
I feel
you're
that
coming
we need
across
to be,
of it that way.
Okay, no, that's fine. I feel that we need to be highly aware of it. And I feel that we need to be constantly vigilant for it. I mean, that's the whole point of you have a republic if you can keep it, Ben Franklin. Like, are we there yet? Not necessarily. But I do believe that there are people who have engaged in social engineering in our society and will continue to do so.
It's going on online right now, which is why I want to do my Fight the Avatar series. But it's not the state doing it's not, or at least not just the state doing it.
Well, no, and that's why I said who owns the state, because I think it's the super wealthy.
Steve Bannon doesn't own the state.
Did you ever watch The Century of the Self by Adam Curtis?
I did not. I don't even know what you're talking about.
Okay, it's a documentary series about how Edward Bernays was asked to socially engineer society into being a consumer culture for the sake of making large quantities of money for the wealthy.
Sure.
And there are more elements to that. That, for one thing, okay, so another set of documentaries, like one of them is called War, and the other one is called Social. It's not called Social Engineering.
Question.
Go ahead.
Since we're talking about this, is this violence to you?
Is what?
What you're talking about?
Which thing?
All of it. The state trying to control people. And
no, I don't think that's violence. That's another play on words I'm really not okay with. Like, this is
what do
violence.
You call it?
Social engineering is one thing. Psyops, you could call it psy-war in its own way. I don't call it physical violence. I actually think it's kind of dangerous for us to play around with the word violence the way that has been played around with lately, because then it becomes the justification for people just to physically attack someone
to be physically violent, right?
Like.
So how would you stop something like this?
The biggest way to stop something like this is to make people aware of how they are susceptible to it, so that they can protect themselves from it.
And if that doesn't work?
If that doesn't work, you should probably move.
but the entire world's controlled by a global elite.
Yes. To more or less, like, to greater and lesser versions. I wouldn't say that under control. I would say that there are pieces on the board, and that just like in the game of Risk, the more you play around, like, you'll have more pieces in some parts of the game and less pieces in others. When you get geopolitical, then you gotta, like, I call it like when you're playing an MMORPG and you use your middle mouse button to scroll way up, rather than just scroll way down, which is like, okay, now I'm in first person view, right? I think that, I think it was actually George Carlin who did a bit about this. He just kind of pointed out, he's like, why is it so unreasonable to suggest that wealthy people would get together and have a plan? And I'm like, well, yeah, it makes perfect sense. And like, you don't even have to go full deep Alex Jones to look at things like the Bilderberg Group and scratch your head like, that's interesting. Why are those people doing that? what I think is the reason why you don't have one solid control is that they are still kind of fighting amongst themselves over which one of them will have more influence. Meaning, whoever those forces are, like because there's different, ebbs and flows and tugging back and forth. So, for example, I fully believe that communist China is trying to manipulate things over here, just as I'm sure we have agents trying to manipulate things over there. So you've got that level where the states do it to each other, right? And then meanwhile, the wealthy have their own interests, and their own motives, and most of them have to do with how can they make themselves more wealthy. Those are not always concurrent with what the states are doing at a given time, but they wield a lot of influence, especially if you have a plutocratic system determining the outcome of your elections, or at least heavily influencing them, right? So that's why I would say is that you can't point at just any one entity, because there's still kind of a war within a war, so to speak, going on between powerful people to determine who's going to get more influence out of it at the end.
Fair enough. I don't entirely agree, but that's because of my own bias, because I'm a statist. So.
Well, and I'm not, that's the other thing I want to be clear, like, I do believe that you can evolve past the state. What I don't agree with is a lot of the current branch of anarchists that I run into have some really unrealistic ideas, and they don't really have a good formula for solving the problems that the state was designed to solve. Like, they just want to
discover them.
Right. Well, right.
Chop.
Let's just turn off. Well, yeah, Chaz Chop's a perfect example of how utterly naive they are. Right. They want to throw a lever and just turn off the police because they think that does it. Like, they think, well, let's turn off state authority, and that's just ignorant of the fact that the authority still exists in places with weak states, and it definitely exists within places with no state. Ask the people under the rule of the Somali warlords, for example. And if you want to know what defunded police looks like, you can look at Mexico versus the cartel. At one point, they finally arrested one of the major leaders of the cartel. So the cartel launched like a military-style attack on the Mexican government, and forced them to give them their back. That's how much power the cartel has. So if you're going to dispose of the state, you better have some idea in your head about how you're going to solve that. And I've heard two different versions from two different members of Antifa saying the quiet part out loud. One of them said that they believed that the Antifa militants themselves would be able to successfully deal with this issue. Not only did Chaz Chop prove that they in no way are competent enough to handle that.
Well, wasn't that a gang leader too, though?
Which one?
Just to be fair.
The
guy that was patrolling the area.
Well, it was, but if you're in a non-state situation, what are you going to do about it?
Well, yeah, but I'm just saying, like, go on. I just want
right. No, it's fine. Some of them believe that they think that Antifa themselves are going to do it, and then the other ones believe, like, I actually just had one spit out that they would prefer to interact with the cartel over the state. Like, they think that it is. Yeah, I got one. It was somebody apparently who was present for the murder of Jay Danielson at the hands of Michael Reinhold, actually was the one who said that, like, well, if the cartel shows up, they'll be on our side. Whose side do you think they are on? The fascists? Or I'm like, no, they're on their side, dude.
They would be the fascist. Like,
well, right. That's just, they don't understand that the state exists to handle the fact that gangs can form and try to grab authority. That's what warlords are. So, like, it's like they seem to be under this impression. Here's an excellent example, because I hammer on anarcho-communists a lot, but anarcho-capitalists are not really much better. Did you watch the Anarchists on HBO?
Yes, I did. Anarcho-Poco.
Right. And they all had this naive belief that Acapulco was their paradise. They're like, see, the government backed off and doesn't have a lot of power and doesn't interfere with people's lives and everybody's living peacefully. And what they found out the hard way was the only reason Acapulco is peaceful is because the cartel wants that gringo money, right? They want Americans to come there and spend money because they make money on the tourism. That's their vested interest in keeping Acapulco peaceful. It's not that there's no authority, and they found that out when they were trying to sell drugs, for example, out of their hotels. And the cartel's like, hey, no, you're not. Just so we're clear, do that and we'll kill you. And they backed off of that. And then eventually one of them did get murdered, and by the cartel, and it seems like it was probably had something to do with drugs. So, but they allowed themselves to believe that the peace in Acapulco was just an example of what happens when the state is absent, when the reality is the peace was just being kept by violent criminals who will behead you and murder you down to every last member of your family. And I just, they don't have an understanding of it, or they naively believe that they could do something to stop them. And, go ahead.
A lot of them just want to be feudal lords, though. That's what it really boils down to. I want my own private police force to deal with my problems and not have anybody tell me what to do.
Well, right. And they don't really. So here's a perfect example. There was an account, actually a fairly prevalent account. The guy was Anti-Fash Gordon on Twitter. Somebody accused him of sexually harassing someone else in Antifa. So then what happened was the faction that believed him and the faction that believed her were all technically Antifa, but they didn't have a way to adjudicate that. Like, well, we're stateless. We're not going to call the cops on each other. Nobody does that, right? But they didn't have a way to handle that. And so I asked them directly, which was hilarious. I'm like, so what are you guys going to do about this? Is this going to be like a popularity contest? You're going to figure out which one of these two people you like more, and that will determine who is and is not guilty? And they couldn't answer me. And a lot of them, obviously, they block you pretty quick when you start putting them against the wall. So the point is that they don't have a way of handling it. They're hoping that they can handle it because they think that the way they operate within the block will be how that they will do everything else. And that doesn't always work out for them either. Like, there was a huge Twitter argument that went on between different Antifa accounts. When Antifa got the crap beat out of them, I want to say it might have been in Olympia, but they were all fighting amongst themselves about whose fault it was that they got their butts kicked, because they didn't really have leaders. They just kind of like somebody would post on whatever social media they were using, hey, we are going here, everybody show up here. And then other people didn't listen to that. So they ended up being outnumbered, and the Proud Boys drove them off in that instance. And that's an example of like, they just have very naive understandings, of what it would actually take, because the cartel doesn't have this problem. The cartel is a very clear chain of command. That was the other thing. Like when you run into the tanky Antifa types, they think that they're the Viet Cong or something. Like they believe that they are armed militants who are just waiting for the opportunity to liberate this country for China. And they don't. I'm like, dude, you have no idea what you're talking about. Well, no, yes, we do. We've been fighting this militarized police force. I'm like, I assure you, fighting war does not look anything like throwing bottles and and yelling obscenities at police who have been ordered not to shoot you. It doesn't look anything like that.
Go join the Russian military against Ukraine.
Well, right. But they don't. It was one of the things actually that Yuri Bezmenov, do you know who that is?
Yuri Bezmenov. It sounds familiar.
It's an older name. So he was a Soviet KGB defector who showed up in the United States.
Oh, was he 70s. The guy that said that laid out all the plans?
Right, and this is how it goes down.
Is manipulations.
What led him to leave was that he had been told the final story, because he was assigned to work in India to try to radicalize them to come into communism. And he found out that a whole bunch of people that he had befriended when he was converting them to communism were slated to be executed if they ever invaded India. And the reason why is because they know they can't trust radicals. They know that if a new regime takes over, they're going to be this group of people who naively believe that they're going to be appointed to positions of authority in some way. And that because they already believe that rioting and uprising is the way to handle it if you don't like what your government's doing, those people can't be tolerated in a tanky authoritarian communist society. So that's why he left. Like, they don't understand that if they ever won, if they ever got what they wanted, they'd all be lined up against the street, up against the wall and shot. Like, because there's no place for them. Like, if China comes over here for some reason, again, this is all really unrealistic, right? But like if they ever actually started taking over this country, it's not going to look anything like what any of those people would want. Like they believe that they do, and that's part of the problem. Is there are people in our education system right now that are telling people a lot of lies about this, and when you try to talk to them, the tankies literally will believe that every negative thing you've ever heard about Stalin is all capitalist propaganda, and everything you've ever heard
Who in
was bad about-
education's doing that?
Who in
exactly?
education?
Yes.
Well, they claim they learn it from their professors.
I'm sure that that's what they claim.
You don't believe that there are professors who do?
There probably are, but they're not anywhere near the majority.
Right, but there's enough to do damage because most of these
There's enough
people,
to do damage. I mean, any
most of
movement.
these people
I'm
get
not gonna
recruited
say that
that
they're
way.
learning it. No, I think most of these people are getting recruited online.
You think they're all getting recruited online? You remember
I
when I
think the
mentioned
majority
earlier
of
about
them
how the
are.
Weather Underground all went into education or law?
Yeah, I am aware what the Weather Underground. Before you even mentioned it, I'm aware what the Weather Underground did. Yes.
Right, I'm just using it as an example of what I'm bringing up here. I'm not saying you're not aware. So
Right.
when I bring up a point, don't assume that I think you're ignorant. It just may mean that it's relevant to what we're saying.
Okay, fair enough.
And I have to be clear about that because I just usually I'm gonna if I bring something up that's valid, if you don't understand it, ask, or if you're not aware of it, ask, and then I'll elaborate. But if I'm making a point, sometimes it's going to be necessary for me to kind of evaluate. Okay, these are the relevant pieces of information. Right, no problem.
I do the same thing.
I just didn't want you to think I was talking down to you or something.
No,
That's definitely not my objective.
We're good. We're fine.
So so you don't believe that there are people in education that are pushing communism?
I don't think there's enough of them in education for it to be a concern of education in general. Does that make sense?
Well, I believe. Okay, I understand where your belief comes from, and this is not something that I have nailed down yet. But there are a lot of people involved in education that at least have enough, proof that there's an awful lot of things that look like Marxism that are being incorporated into our education now.
Such as?
So, for example, what are your thoughts on critical race theory?
Critical race theory is a Marxian lens to look at the relations between race and class within the United States.
Well,
or pretty much any imperialist, colonialist area.
So
you can use it to do the same thing in Singapore, for example.
Well, right. So, but as you just pointed out, it's Marxian, right?
Sure, there's nothing wrong with that.
So if you're teaching communism or Marxism...
No, okay, so let me be clear. So it is a philosophical, not even philosophical, it is a critical lens in which to evaluate what is going on from a sociological perspective. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's like, oh, we have to destroy the entire structure to rebuild it. That's not necessarily what it means. There's some people that are going to think that. But it's really like a critical analysis thing. It would be the same thing of looking at, if you're an anti-state, it's the same way of using anarchy to look at the lens, using anarchy as a lens to look, to critique the state.
So we have a term that we're using then called lens, and that is to say that you're looking at this information from this perspective. Okay, correct. So one of the problems when discussing critical race theory is that there are a lot of different people, and this is before we even get into any Fox News stuff, okay, with different motives and different energies and how they interpret what it's supposed to mean and what its final function is. When you read the original documents, whether you're talking about Kimberly Crenshaw's work or anybody else, you find that there's a lot of stuff in it that literally just takes its roots from Black nationalism, pro-segregation, right? So yeah. But as you pointed out, it's Marxian. So I get that, and maybe that's not straight up communism, but it tends to be a radicalization effort towards a certain end. And
why do you think it's a radicalization effort rather than being a critical analysis?
What is okay? Well, the end result of it, how often do you get involved with that and recognize that you're dealing with people who also then eventually start talking about being anti-capitalist? Where are those people headed next?
Okay, I see. Well, I would say it depends on the person, because I am not anti-capitalist, but I think CRT is useful.
Okay, my perspective on capitalism is that I would like to see us eventually evolve out of it. I think
Mhm.
eventually it will happen regardless because I don't think it's sustainable. However, we should not and could not replace it with authoritarian communism or
And
with
I would say that most Marx
anarcho-communism.
I would say that most people that use Marxism as a lens in which to critique capitalism or any other social structure for that matter that ends up cleaving around some sort of class structure, because you're going to have a different class structure in every single society, don't necessarily see it that way either.
Well, now
Like
we've
they're not going to
obviously
go AMCOM for it.
moved. Well, Antifa is largely ANCOM. At least they believe
Of
they
course,
are.
Antifa is that, but
Right,
you know,
but and
whatever.
then Black Lives Matters founders, and obviously we know that they're grifting now, but they all started
Well,
off
yeah,
as Marxist activists.
sure.
And then you look at Weather Underground, which was straight up communist, and they're
Yeah.
influencing all of those groups.
I think you're not wrong. I just don't have the same level of concern that you do because one, it's not very large. Two, probably a little bit of my political bias. And three, again, these lenses to which to critique the world are useful. When I look at geopolitical stuff, I use realpolitik as a lens, as well as democratic peace theory as a lens to look at how the world operates on a nation to nation level.
So Scrappy from my chat is asking, can you tell us how you feel critical race theory is useful?
Critical race theory is useful because it allows a person to look at the power structures that exist within a nation that may or may not cleave around race. Within the United States context, as well as other former colonial powers, what it does, it allows you to actually look at it from another perspective in order to find out what can or cannot be fixed when it comes to systemic issues that cleave around race as a class. And if we're going to be honest, race is a class structure within the United States as well as other former colonial powers.
Well,
It
and
was explicitly set up to try to emulate feudalism after white people threw off the yoke of serfdom.
so I guess my question usually comes about, and this is the same thing to do with systemic racism, is that do we have examples of currently functioning systemic racism that are not also simply just systemic classism?
Yes,
Like what?
pretty much anything that deals with the war on drugs,
You war
housing
on drugs is
situations, and
systemic
wealth disparity.
racism. It's not systemic classism.
Correct. War on Drugs was specifically designed to go after both the anti-war protesters of Vietnam, as well as to control the rising black population within the United States that was getting a little more not nationalistic. That's not a good word for it. Forceful in their demands for equality.
Let me ask a question then, and this is not in any way to frame you negatively, but what has been your socioeconomic background since
I
childhood?
grew up poor.
You grew up poor. Okay.
Yes,
So
I was.
you've never been to
If it wasn't,
the trailer
let
park
me
ghettos that have a huge
let,
heroin epidemic, for example?
let me let me say how I grew up poor.
Okay, go ahead.
If it was not for the fact that Medicaid got expanded in the early 90s, I would not be as intellectually fluid as I am now because I literally could not read because I did not know I needed glasses.
Okay, no, and that's
So
definitely
that's
poor. Now, my
yeah.
question would then be, because I grew up white trash in either the trailer park ghettos that people tend to forget exist that are predominantly white, or and in the inner city ghettos, and both of them are absolutely subject to the war on drugs. That's why when you say that systemic racism, that ignores to me the fact that this problem exists absolutely just as much in poor
No,
communities across the racial spectrum.
the original impetus of the war on drugs was to control anti-war activists and black people. It always ends up spilling over to the wider population and people to get addicted to drugs for a number of different reasons, but largely it's to deal with the real world, and the despair in which they're suffering under, and that repression comes through in those kind of ways. And thank you, F Bombs, for the raid. Appreciate it. 29 people joined the chat, so we're gonna keep going
Yeah, sure.
for a bit.
No, it's no problem. Um, so okay, so I guess I don't know that because I was mildly distracted at the same time you were saying that, but like, um, okay, so if we've established, okay, now the link between the war on drugs and anti-war protesters, I have not seen that. I'm not saying that that's not possible. Okay,
Nixon literally said it was part of the reason.
Okay. I wouldn't surprise me. I'm not opposed to what you're just suggesting. Okay. However, what I have come to experience being on all sides of this is like, as far as like the racial part of it. Remember one of the arguments I got into specifically with Occupy Detroit when it started to become woke was, there was a resolution that was passed or something to cut like funding to Detroit schools, and they said, well, it's obviously because there's black kids living there. And I said, no, I assure you, there's no magic unicorn, parachute getting the white kids out of there. They don't really care one way or the other. They care if you're poor or not. In my view, and ironically, most of this originally came from talking to a socialist from the United Kingdom, pointed out that the race thing is a way to get us fighting each other to ensure that we never unite. And
but I disagree with that.
You disagree with that? Okay, no, that's fine.
Well, no, I mean it might be the intention, but it doesn't have to be. It's not an inevitability.
Okay, well, I guess what I'm getting at is that I don't feel, and it's been this way. Sorry, it's been this way for many years that if there is a poor, it doesn't matter the color of any of the people involved, they find ways to divide them. And organically, poor people also tend to become tribal on their own and divide themselves. So that's why I say you're looking at systemic classism and making the issue entirely racism.
Who said it entirely?
Oh, okay. Well, when you say, for example, that the war on drugs is a systemic racist thing, as if all of the white trash kids that are addicted to heroin and meth right now don't exist, which I'm not saying that's what you said, but that's what gets implied. And it's
if that's what gets implied, this is an issue of not knowing what happened in the past and trying to compare it just to what's happening now. So let's rewind this, okay? In the 90s, meth was pretty much only targeting white people. So all the ads on anti-meth stuff in the 90s were all about white people around the Midwest being either in trailers or in apartments, getting high and turning tricks in order to get meth. That was every single freaking ad. They're amazing. You can look them up on YouTube. It's disgusting, but it is what it is, right? Go back to the 80s. It was crack. Everything about crack was black people. Go back to the 70s. Everything about heroin was black people. Go back to the 1950s and 40s. Everything about pot was Mexicans and black people. Cocaine was not targeted as forcefully as crack, partly because it was the drug of choice among affluent white people, and also because they really wanted to, with the war on drugs and things like that, they wanted to control some of the black population. We can't ignore these things. I'm not saying that you're saying.
Well, I'm not ignoring it per se, but I would say I've just known too many white crack addicts to agree with that.
But they're not being specifically targeted by these laws for the disparity that exist. The black people were. And those laws that end up getting created end up spilling over onto the poor white population because it's a law that is trying to not be as racialized, at least in how it was written, even though that was the intention of the people to write it. Because Lee Atwater said you can't go around saying the N-word all the time anymore. You have to talk about integrated busing. You have to talk about, or forced busting rather. You have to talk about drugs. You have to talk about violent crime in Chicago. You have to couch these issues that have racial overtones or undertones, depending on how subtle you're being, into a broader narrative in order to avoid the people that are going to outright and see that you're a bigot among the less racialized people, even though those are the people that are writing the laws are doing it for those reasons.
Okay, so I guess this is where we're going to come to a point where maybe this is where I feel that you're a little more conspiratorial than I am about it. Which is to say that I don't think these people really think up how to specifically target black people anymore.
It's not anymore. That's why it's systemic. So when you come to systemic issues, you don't have to have out and out racist for it to continue. The system itself was designed in such a way that it perpetuates the racism.
Okay. So when we got past the point where we weren't redlining anymore and we're not Jim Crowing anymore, is there a point at which we just acknowledge that rather than trying to segregate and more importantly, and this is where it becomes a problem of division, when we were at Occupy, for example, and wokeness showed up, we went from the unified 99% who literally really felt like seamlessly like one tribe, right? Like if you watch The Walking Dead, for example, the characters in it are usually from extremely diverse backgrounds. There may sometimes be some individual racist characters, like Daryl's brother, for example. But at the same time, it brought people together from all of these different walks of life who may not have ever interacted. And the reason I bring that up is because that's what Occupy camps were like when it started. Okay. Then wokeism shows up, and then it becomes necessary to create a hierarchy of oppression, which is to say that my point of view, my words, my feelings are more important than yours due to my place on this progressive stack. And it's one thing to be sure that people of color get their voice heard, which absolutely they should, but I don't really feel we had that problem before wokeness showed up. But at the same time, then it becomes a problem of, well, not only do we need to be sure that they're heard, they're right and you're wrong on the basis of the fact that you're straight or male or white or cis or whatever.
I have not had this experience.
You've never seen that happen? Okay, well.
No, I have not had the direct experience, so
right.
I can't speak on it. I've heard people tangentially talk about it. I have been in rooms where some of this was talked about, but it was not ever, you need to shut up. You don't know what you're talking about. You're wrong because of X. It was more of people venting frustrations and then coming back to the table to talk about it.
So you've never been told check your privilege?
No. Well, I've been told that online, but that's not real life.
Okay, well, no.
And I've been told that by other white people more so. So we'll just put
which is hilarious. I don't disagree. And then the other funny thing is that they there are rules about saying, well, a black person is talking and you can't possibly understand this problem better than them, so you should just shut up, white guy. Comes to a screeching halt the second that black person is John McWhorter or Candace Owens or
I am well aware of these things.
Right, and
so,
again,
no, I'm saying I understand where you're coming from.
So my point is so what ended up happening because of that is that Occupy fractured into essentially warring factions fighting for dominance over which one of them was more important than the other, and classism stopped being the focus. And you can watch there's actually somebody gathered the statistics specifically about how the media's coverage of Occupy changed, and specifically how all of these extremely divisive concepts like white privilege, like gender identity and all of that became the primary focus of what everybody wanted to talk about all of a sudden. And
I don't recall that.
Okay, well, I understand. I can give you the video with the stats on it, but
well, no, I don't disbelieve you. I don't recall it. So
no, and that's totally fine. But now even more prominent progressive leftists are starting to report the same thing. Crystal Ball did a video about it because I would say that sociological bomb was planted in the Occupy movement, and then it has since moved on because now it's in the Sunrise movement. It's basically everywhere it goes, because what happens in a woke inquisition is after you've run out of witches, you start turning on each other to figure out which one of you is the more holy. That's how it turns out. So
that's leftism in general. I don't think this is particular. Yeah, this is the quintessential problem with leftism.
Right. Okay. Well, I have been around leftists who were not thinking like that. I guess that would be my main point. That's why I pointed out that the Socialist Party of UK did a video called "Capitalism and Other Kid Stuff," and they pointed out that this is an attempt to divide and conquer the poor to prevent them from being unified in their purpose. And that's one of the reasons.
But so the UK's got a particular thing. Like this is the problem I have with some of these conversations.
Sure.
But the UK has a problem with racism as well. But it's not the same kind of problem with racism that exists in, say, South Africa or the United States or South America or Australia. Because the UK exported it to these places and didn't import, and then imported some of these people in and had to deal with it in a different way, right? So when you're talking about class in these areas, you can't talk. You have to also talk about race. It's part of it. Race is part of the class structure within the United States. It's slowly ebbing away.
But it
it's not
depends
gone.
on what is the consequence of the way you go about it. Like,
Sure,
how
I'm
does
not going
that?
to I'm not going to disagree with you that a lot of people do this wrong. Okay,
So,
a
like,
lot of people do it
obviously,
wrong.
before wokeness showed up at Occupy, if somebody called someone the N word, we would have picked them up and physically thrown them out of the camp, right? That was
Okay,
already understood. But when it became about things like, I think there are entirely too many white males talking in this panel, that needs to stop. When it becomes about that's when you become not only does that divide and destroy, it renders things ineffective, because that's why I said it's dividing a new hierarchy, creating a new hierarchy in the name of equality. We're going
okay.
to create a new hierarchy.
Do you think then? I guess the point of contention would be: do you think that there needs to be any particular fixes done to fix the racial issue,
I think that the
or can it just
assimilation.
be? Hold on,
Go
or
ahead.
to follow up, just sorry. So, do you think there's anything that needs to be particularly done to fix the racial issue, or do you think it's all ultimately just class, and class can if you fix class, you fix everything else?
Well, I do, but with a caveat. Okay,
Mm.
the assimilation slash desegregation and we are all one people strategy that Martin Luther King supported, as opposed to because like that's just one of the reasons we brought up critical race theory. Elements of critical race theory, like in particular Crenshaw's book, just openly says, yeah, that wasn't correct. We need to look more closely at what Malcolm X said. And this is back when Malcolm X was like a full-on black nationalist, black supremacist, racist. Okay, that segregation was better, and that we need to recognize as ourselves and be very big on gaining race consciousness among
Uh-huh.
black people. Okay,
Do you understand that? Can you steelman that argument though,
can
or
I
do you just
steel man
disagree?
it?
Do you,
Well,
okay,
they end up
to be
believing.
better
Oh, go ahead.
to be better phrased rather than steelman it. Do you understand the actual reasons why those arguments are being made, or and if you do, can you explain that?
Well, when you invoke Malcolm X at that time period of his life, they quite literally believe that black people are superior to white people. Like, it's literally
So
just
so
it's an
absent
inversion of
absent
the Ku Klux Klan.
so absent national Nation of Islam issues, because he eventually retreated from some of that and became a segregationist. Do you
Right, and then he got
understand why
shot for it.
right? Do you understand why the segregationist argument would make sense to somebody? I
Well,
guess would be
when
the
you
best way
talk
to
to
say
most
it.
of the people that I have about it, is that they literally believe that they are safer, better, and then it bleeds into like just supremacy ideology. You start hearing the
Sure,
white people are
you
not
get you
really
get that too.
human. They're from
Yeah,
caves. And what I noticed
right.
about it is that is pretty crazy sounding the first time you hear it, but like that's another element within, like, the black racists were kind of a fringe group with the exception of the Nation of Islam, and they've used Black Lives Matter as an opportunity for them to recruit, and they do it in a way that's very subtle. It
Yeah,
doesn't start
every
off
every
with.
racist group uses every kind of schism to try to recruit racists into their
Right,
fold.
and they've also
Um,
always got a story that implies that they are the victim, and that they are the heroes, and and therefore it's justified for them to do whatever they feel they need to do, and then it's they have their own version of manifest destiny. They have their own version of, like, so that's also why I
sure.
brought up critical race theory. Also, is that because when I said that there are different people with different levels of understanding or how they imply it, this is before, again, we're not even talking about conservatives yet. We're talking about people within that movement. So, like, I did a video where I reviewed a video that got released on The Root. Are you familiar with The Root?
I do. I am familiar with Root.
Yeah, it's
Yes.
like kind of like a black, like BET for YouTube, so to speak, but considerably, I would call them more radical. But
Yeah, they're lefty. Yeah.
yeah. So, but the point is that it's meant to be a Black Issues network. They brought on
Yeah.
Brittany Cooper, who is a Rutgers professor who has done TED Talks on these topics before, And among the things that she said was that, critical race theory is an accurate understanding of history, and that's why people oppose it. And the reality is that people of color were peacefully sailing the oceans and trading with each other until white people showed up, and that black people never
Anybody
engaged in
says that's dumb.
imperialism. Well, I know, but that's the thing. she's an academic who's teaching this stuff in colleges right now. Like that's the reason they brought her on the route, right?
Sure.
I agree with you that that's ridiculous. It doesn't change the fact, unfortunately, that there are a lot more people who feel that way than we tend to know, and just like any other cult, they start you with the really easy to grasp stuff, and then it starts to evolve as you get more and more radicalized, and that's when you start hearing the melanin
that could
theory.
That could be applied to not Marxist, but leftist ideology in general, right?
Yeah, to some extent. I mean, obviously, like, for example, for me, I kind of know. I kind of try to tell people, I'm like, so because people are like, well, was Bernie Sanders a communist? I'm like, at one stage of his life he was, but at least what he's pushing for now is not. It's not communism. It's just more social safety nets, in an existing capitalist system. That's what Denmark is. That's what social democracy / democratic socialism is supposed to be. And it's funny when you get into those arguments too, because conservatives get really mad. They're like, well, Bernie Sanders is a liar. Denmark's not a socialist country. And they'll be the same people that you were just arguing with a minute ago about, say, Medicare for all. They'll be like, well, we can't have that. That'll make us a communist country.
Socialism, yeah.
Like,
that's actual socialism. Okay, buddy.
Right. So Denmark has those things. So are they communist or not? And then they get quiet.
the reason I ask these questions, and maybe another 13 minutes or so before we call it quits. Do you think that's okay? Sure.
Sorry, I didn't know what our limit was. Go ahead.
It's 2 hours is good.
Sure.
But the reason I ask these questions is because I don't think you have any of these movements whatsoever without the racism that actually exists, or at least existed, if you want to say it doesn't exist now. And if you fix that, then it goes away. Or mostly. I mean, some of it's going to be cemented, right? That's just how people are. Things perpetuate or whatever. But it mostly goes away. There's no recruitment tool without it. Like, you can't recruit people into it unless they're, on the outskirts anyways, instead of being mainstream.
Well, when it comes to curing the problem, as far as to fixing the situation for the people in question, and I say this as somebody who grew up there, and I interviewed Pastor Corey Brooks. I don't know if you know who he is.
Sounds familiar.
Corey Brooks is an activist in Chicago who sets up like community outreach to get kids jobs and to keep them out of gangs and like actual.
He's also part of the anti-violence coalition.
He absolutely is.
So I do know what you're talking about. Yeah.
And he was very truthful about the riots didn't help us, right?
Sure.
Anyway, we have to, when it comes to the way that critical race theory gets talked about, and especially the way that it, like, for example, because they tried to bring it into our schools where I live now, which is a small country town. I'm like, look, if you want to address the problem that you're concerned about, we have to change the culture in their communities. And that means they have to, again, have advocates and mentors who push them towards education, who push them away from gangs, who get them out.
Do you think that's not happening?
Unfortunately, not with anywhere near enough vigor as the amount of energy we spend on blaming white people for everything.
Are you sure?
Yes.
We're just going to have to disagree with that.
Well, no, I to be clear, I still go there. I participate in some of these mentoring programs myself. And what ends up happening is a guy like Pastor Corey Brooks struggles to keep his funding in order, and Black Lives Matter sits on millions.
Yeah, because BLM, the national organization, was able to convince a bunch of white people to give up some money to feel better.
Okay, yes, but then let's look at this. At that point, then, what should be the priority? Should addressing the issue of police violence be the priority, or should be creating? Hold on, I'm not done. Or should be creating circumstances that lower the crime rates within those areas be the priority?
And police.
Okay, why are the police a bigger threat than the gang culture itself?
because the police create a distrust within the system itself.
You believe the
And as long
police
as
are a
that
bigger
stress-
danger than the gang
It's not
culture?
about danger. It's not about danger. It's
Okay.
about distrust in the system and distrust in institutions. Anytime the police mess up, it breaks the social trust that welds a community together. And as long as that social trust isn't there, you can't fix any of the other problems. As long as people don't trust the police, they're not going to report they're not going to report criminals to the police because they themselves don't trust the police to actually solve the issue and not find themselves as being a person that reports this issue to the police as being part of the problem.
You don't think that the fact that the culture that is there venerates crime and criminals and makes them their heroes? Yes.
The culture that is there is part of the function of the racist system that existed that created it.
Well, the reason I don't call that racist anymore either is that it affects everybody who lives there. If you'd ever met my sister, you would never believe we were related. She doesn't talk anything like me, not even close to the same values. I think one of the cool things about the movie Gran Torino is that it infects the Asians who live there too. It's literally anybody who lives in that situation.
It is anybody who lives there now.
Yes.
But if the majority of people that live there do not have a trust in the police, no one's going to report anything. And so you have to get the trust back in the police first in order to actually go and fix anything, because these systems have to be dismantled. These gangs rather, have to be dismantled from the top down, essentially, because that's how you dismantle criminal organizations. And you're not going to be able to do that from a bottom up perspective of just changing the culture a bit, because the culture is being influenced by the amount of opportunities that they have and the lack of trust they have in the community itself.
Okay, well, you're taking a different angle on this than I would have normally expected. The question is that doesn't sound like a defund or abolish argument, obviously, right?
No, I'm not for defund the police.
Reform, obviously, and even the cops I talk to are on board with that. So, like,
reform doesn't mean anything. That's the problem.
You got to ask them. Like, there's a really good video that I share where Jocko Willink is talking to Joe Rogan about this, and he points out that he's like, they should be spending at least 10% of their time training and refining their skills. There's no time set aside for that within police activity at all. And then they talk about the de-escalation training. The lady that Joe Rogan brought on later, who does that, gets to talk to cops like once a year. And
it's an allocation of resources problem, because it's cheaper to just it's literally the system is designed in such a way that it is cheaper and more cost effective in the short term for police to be a little more aggressive and break trust than it is to actually spend the money on the front end to train them better and hire more of them.
Okay, well, and that's definitely different than what you normally hear when people say they want to prioritize the police. But it's, so that's good. What I would get at is that I guess it sounds to me like what you're saying is that we need to affect the police issues so that people will have more trust in them, and then that allows the state to more effectively handle the gang problem. Is that
correct?
Okay, so that's
you increase the trust within the city, the system, the police, everything else, right? The structure of trust. You fix that structure of trust, then the community with that trust will end up going and like, hey, so and so down the block is selling drugs, and that needs to stop. That gets reported more because they actually have the trust in the system to actually go address that in a way that doesn't bring down the power of the state on the whole community.
So then the question then also becomes at that point, I've said this for a while, people don't even know or don't think about the fact that they elect their sheriff. What if more effort was put into electing and campaigning for sheriffs that will help to solve the problems you're talking about, instead of emphasizing a lot on yelling and screaming about the latest person who got shot?
Well, a lot of people, the latest person that got shot is an immediate fix that needs to happen now. And so that's the issue, right? A lot of people, we don't have good civics education within the United States. You haven't had it in decades, 40 years plus, I would say. And so people don't know what sheriffs do. That's a problem. Shout out to John Oliver for trying to get people to understand that, but only lefties are listening to that.
Well, and in addition to that, mayoral candidates, you can make the appointment of the chief of police a key issue to whether or not they're going to get elected.
That was the other thing I was going to say. So not every city or municipality has a sheriff, or the sheriff has different powers. In these major metropolitan areas, it's usually the mayor that has more power in dealing with this, or the city council if they have a weak mayor system. And
Right.
nobody knows about any of that.
Well,
Because
right,
again,
and
civic
that's
education
and
doesn't
it's
exist.
interesting is that when I bring that up, most of these protesters are not interested in that. They're interested in just they feel like if they get the police out of their hair, that everything will suddenly be fine.
Because that
Or
is
that-
the immediate problem in their eyes, because that is the most in the face problem that they have.
Them killing each other is not.
Okay, so see, I mean, I understand where you're coming from, so I'm not gonna.
This is why I said the gang
go down
element is a bigger problem, in my opinion.
The gang element wouldn't necessarily exist if there was a stronger social trust within the city, in my opinion.
So you feel
Also,
that the
the
state
gang-
would be
the
more
gang
effective
element
at
would-
cracking down, is what you're getting at?
The state would be more effective at cracking down with stronger trust between the citizens and their state, and that includes police officers. There would also be less of a gang problem had there been actual investment in these communities directly, rather than just letting them basically be on their own after literal centuries of oppression.
How do you get people to invest in communities?
That's a tough one.
Well, here's a good
It's
one
gonna-
for you, because it's relevant to what we were talking about. Does burning down a city make people more interested in investing in it?
But the burning down the city is so. This is the thing. So burning down the city is the culmination, oftentimes, of all these issues coming to a head and it causing violence. It's not that these people are doing it to get fixes. They're doing it because they're venting a frustration.
Well, that's
You like to quote MLK. So
well, I
Martin
do.
Luther
I
King said
do.
that the riots are riots are
Make sure that
the voice of the
you
unheard.
mention the rest of what he said in that same talk, though, which is that he will continue to condemn riots because they cause
Yes,
more
you
problems than
condemn
they
them.
solve. Right.
Yeah, you condemn them, but you have to fix the issues that caused them in the first place.
Do you
which
know
is
what
I'm talking
started
about.
the fight between the armed group and the Black Lives Matter rioters in Kenosha? Do you know what they were arguing about?
I don't know exactly what you're referring to, so I
So
can't say.
what actually started the conflict? Because if you watch all of the raw video, initially they were like,
Are
"Oh,
you-
okay, you guys are just here. Okay, that's cool." And then they started arguing and
Oh.
fighting with each other. What was that about?
You're talking about the instance of the dumpster fire?
Well, the dumpster fire was one part of it. That's where Rosenbaum becomes more directly involved.
Yes.
But leading up to that, it was that they were finding that their attempts at arson were being interfered with by this group of citizenry. That's what their problem was.
Okay.
And then there were groups, there were leaders among their group who were specifically, encouraging people to engage in that behavior. So that's what I'm saying is that I wouldn't say that it's just like, if it's just frustration, I don't think we just go out and say burn down the business of a immigrant Hispanic couple. They lost their livelihood in Kenosha.
I don't know who these leaders are, so I can't talk about what you're saying because
No, I understand.
I
I would just watch the video, but there are people that are like that at a lot of these things.
I've probably seen it.
And they literally believe, because they'll say that this is like the Boston Tea Party. We're doing this because we feel that this is going to improve things.
And those people need to get fucked.
Right, okay.
Accelerationists are part of the problem.
Right.
But I'm saying that these accelerationists would have less people to accelerate with if these issues didn't exist. I am going to try to fix the systems because there's actual control that I can have over systems. I don't have control over people.
Well, I mean, activism is supposed to be about trying to persuade people to change their behavior. And I think, first of all, I'm very happy to hear somebody else point out that sheriffs and chiefs of police are way more important, that we don't understand how our own system works. What bothers me is that I know there are other people who know what you and I know about that, but that's not their priority. And, you
can't force people to prioritize things.
Well, no, you can if you want them to be effective. Well, that's why I said when you
argue, you can't force them to.
You can't force them to. I agree. But when we argue among ourselves as activists, that's why I said when we were on the panel, I said you can't just do things because you think it's going to make you feel good. Is it going to be effective? Right. So where I don't have the force to do, to say, hey, stop burning stuff. We definitely policed ourselves really well back in Occupy in ways that we're not doing now.
Well, at least in Occupy where you were participating in.
For the most part, Occupy was a nonviolent movement.
Right.
So anyway, this has been a fantastic talk. There's a lot of layers and like trying to like figure out how to understand where you're coming from. So that's really cool. Because most people are kind of canned into, well, I believe this or I believe that. So we should definitely talk again sometime.
No, I agree. This was a great conversation. If any of your audience would like to learn more about some of the stuff that I hold near and dear with this, you can go check out my channel at Crowdsource Politics on YouTube. There is a 3-part series that does talk about police reform or systematic reform. I might do one just about on crime in general, but that one was targeting systems. There's an episode about bail reform. There's an episode about recidivism in prisons, and there's an episode about police reform. So you can check it out. Each of them are about 30 minutes each. It's just me talking at the camera, so it's not very fun to watch, but listening to it, it's pretty good. So.
And I would advise to you, I think you should talk to Strategic Eyes, and I could get him to be a guest on your show, as he's an African-American police officer right now.
Sure.
And I think you would really like to talk to him. But and he can provide insight, obviously, from being black and from being a cop, and he isn't like a conservative either. So, but anyway, and to people in your audience, it's the same concept basically. You can go to hy.page/V-RADIO to find my content. You can watch me on different mediums. I'm on Twitch. I don't really have a following there. I'm mostly on YouTube. You can also check me out on Rumble, Odyssey, BitChute, Spotify. I basically just kind of like throw a cluster bomb of information on as many mediums as I can, because I use a lot of raw footage and I talk about a lot of topics that the algorithm is not fond of. So as a consequence, for the sake of redundancy, and I'm in a lot of different places. So
for sure.
But,
and there people that say you shouldn't be on different platforms because there's a bunch of like Nazis on them or whatever, don't understand how you have to convince people. You have to meet them where they are. And
well, yeah, there are good
eventually
people on BitChute, for example, and it gets called Nazi YouTube. I'm like, okay, but there are people who are not Nazis there who just want to talk about stuff that you can't talk about on other channels. It'll get deleted, and not everything that gets deleted by social media, by their policies, is Nazism. Sometimes it's relevant stuff like that is on your side of thinking. So I get you. I get what you're saying there for sure. But so thanks again for having me on, and I look forward to hearing more from you and checking out your content. And I will definitely put you in touch with Strategic Eyes, because I think you and he should have a conversation about fixing the system for cops to be able to do their jobs better.
For sure. I very much would appreciate that, man. And I greatly appreciate you coming on. Everybody go follow V-RADIO at all the places he said, specifically YouTube, because you can find a lot of his stuff there. So appreciate it, V-RADIO.
Yep. Take care.
All right. You too, man. I'm going to close out.